The sea has a way of humbling everything it touches. Even the great wooden ships, towering masts, proud sails, and flags of empires were, in truth, fragile prisons of oak and rope drifting across endless cold. Inside, men lived packed together like salted fish, breathing the same damp air, sleeping on narrow hammocks that swung with every sigh of the ocean. And though they carried barrels of rum and crates of biscuits, there was one thing a ship could almost never safely carry: a fire. On land, warmth was the simplest comfort. You gathered wood, struck flint, and watched the orange glow drive away the chill. But at sea, that same glow could be the spark of destruction. A single ember, falling between planks soaked in tar or oil, could turn a ship into a floating pyre within minutes. For centuries, sailors learned this lesson the hardest way, through fire and loss. So, aboard the great wooden ships of the 17th, 18th, and even early 19th centuries, warmth had to come from somewhere else. Imagine yourself there. The night is black. The waves whisper against the hull, and the temperature dips so low that breath becomes mist in the lantern light. The boards are wet to the touch, always wet from sea spray, rain, and the breath of 100 men trapped below deck. There are no windows, no chimney, no hearth, just the heavy smell of tar, sweat, and brine, and still, men survived. Somehow, through winters and storms, through months of endless grey skies, they found ways to stay alive, and even, at times, comfortable. The first secret was clothing. Not the crisp uniforms of naval paintings, but layers of practical warmth. Wool was the sailor's shield. It was heavy, scratchy, and smelled faintly of lanolin, but it kept heat even when soaked. Every sailor, from the lowest deckhand to the quartermaster, learned to love wool. They wore thick woolen socks, long underwear, coarse shirts, and over those, great woolen jumpers or jackets lined with oiled canvas to resist the wind. Oiled didn't mean luxurious. It meant literally rubbed with linseed or fish oil until it could repel water. The smell was terrible, but the warmth was precious. Their beds, if you could call them that, were hammocks slung from beams in the gun deck. Each hammock was a cocoon, a strip of canvas or tightly woven fabric that swayed with the ship. It might sound uncomfortable, but it was a clever invention. The fabric held the sailor close, conserving body heat. The motion of the ship kept air flowing around them, but not too much. When you're in a wooden world surrounded by cold iron cannon and sea wind, even a thin hammock can feel like a nest. The men would climb in fully clothed, often wrapping themselves in whatever spare garment they had. A jacket, a sailcloth, even an old rope mat if it was dry. Once 100 men did this at once, their collective warmth turned the deck below into something like a human furnace, crude but effective. The air below decks was thick, not warm in the pleasant way of a home, but dense and heavy with breath. A strange sort of warmth that came not from flame, but from life itself. The more men aboard, the warmer it got, especially on long nights when hatches were sealed to keep out spray. Condensation gathered on the beams and dripped like rain. The smell was unbearable to visitors, but for sailors it was the smell of survival. Heat in its own human form. Still, the cold could bite through everything. Fingers would numb during night watches. Ice formed on ropes and sails. Men wrapped their hands in rags or stuffed them into pockets of canvas to keep them from freezing stiff. The officers on deck fared little better. Even with their fine coats and gloves, they stood for hours in the open, steering by stars or shouting orders through the wind. Below, the men learned tricks, ancient seafaring secrets, to cheat the chill. Some kept small heated stones in cloth pouches. Before setting sail, or during rare stays in port, they'd heat smooth stones and seal them in bags, tucking them into their bunks as crude warmers. The heat didn't last long, but in the dead of night, a little warmth could mean the difference between sleep and shivering till dawn. Others used salt, yes, ordinary sea salt, to hold warmth. They'd fill small pouches, dampen them, and hang them near lanterns during the brief times lamps were allowed to burn. The salt would stay warm for a surprising amount of time, radiating gentle heat. Lanterns themselves were precious. Aboard ships, fire was only allowed in controlled iron boxes. Tiny enclosed lanterns with thick glass and little air holes. Even then, they were watched constantly. A lantern could light a corner of the hold, but never truly heat it. Still, sailors often gathered near them, letting the faint warmth touch their faces for a moment before it vanished into the damp. Officers and cooks had one small advantage: the galley stove. Every ship had one, usually built of iron and kept inside a fireproof compartment lined with bricks or sand. It was tiny and constantly tended by a cook who lived in fear of setting the ship ablaze. But that stove did more than cook food. It gave off warmth. The men who worked near it lingered just a little longer, taking in the heat, pretending to adjust the pot or stir a barrel of porridge. Even a minute near the galley could be a blessing. But most warmth came not from these small tricks. It came from discipline, from movement. Ships ran on routine: dawn watch, midday duties, sail handling, cleaning, drills, repairs. Every sailor worked constantly, and work kept blood flowing. You scrubbed the deck, you hauled ropes, you climbed masts, not just because the captain ordered it, but because stillness meant cold. The sea demanded motion, and that motion kept men alive. There was a kind of poetry in that the act of serving, of laboring endlessly, became its own warmth. Yet at night, when the ship grew still and only the watchman remained above, the true challenge began. The sound of the ocean never stopped. Wind hummed through the rigging, waves slapped against the hull, and wood creaked like a living creature. The cold air seeped through every crack. Men whispered prayers, shared jokes, or told stories in the dark. Tales of warmer lands, of ports with fires and women and sun. Sometimes they sang softly, their voices echoing through the planks, blending with the sea's rhythm until it became something like a lullaby. The sailors of that era were not pampered men. They were survivors of a world where warmth had to be earned. Each voyage was a slow battle against the elements, and victory was measured in comfort found where none should exist. When morning came and pale light spilled through the hatches, they rose with stiff hands and aching limbs, ready to face another day of wind and salt and cold. For them, the absence of fire wasn't a punishment. It was simply part of the CS bargain. Fire could destroy a ship in minutes, but the sea destroyed slowly, patiently, and only those who respected its rules survived. So the sailors learned to live without flame, to turn their bodies, their clothes, their movement, and their fellowship into sources of warmth. It was not luxury, it was endurance, and in endurance there was a strange kind of peace. Fire aboard a wooden ship was a whisper of death. Every creak of the hull, every gust of wind through the rigging reminded sailors how close they lived to catastrophe. The sea might freeze a man, starve him, drown him, but only fire could erase an entire world in minutes. A spark could undo a year's voyage, and so sailors learned to live as though the very idea of flame were cursed. Lanterns were locked in iron cages, their wicks trimmed short, their glass thick and clouded with soot. No man was allowed to strike flint without the quartermaster's permission. Smoking a pipe was a privilege that could vanish after a single careless ember. Even the cook, the only man trusted with flame, moved like a priest tending a sacred relic. His galley stove sat inside a box of sand and brick, chained to the deck, watched day and night. When the wind roared too high, he smothered the fire until the storm passed, and the crew ate cold biscuits in silence. The rule came from centuries of tragedy. Every sailor knew stories of ships that had burned under bright skies. The HMS Boyne, a 98-gun warship, vanished in 1795 when a spark from the spirit room turned her into an inferno. Men leapt overboard as cannon heated in their sockets and exploded. The sea around her boiled with debris. And then there was the Kent, an East Indiaman, that caught fire in 1825 while carrying families to India. A lantern fell, the flames ran down an oiled rope, and the ship became a funeral pyre. Survivors later said the sky itself turned red. Tales like these spread faster than rumor. They became law. To a sailor, fire was treachery made visible. The wood that held the ship together was soaked in tar, the ropes dressed in pitch, the sails rubbed with oil to repel rain. Every plank, every fibre was waiting for heat to betray it. That was the cruel paradox of the sea. The very materials that made a vessel strong also made it tinder dry when the wind blew hard enough. So they gave up warmth to keep their world afloat. Still, men are stubborn. Some risked small comforts, a pipe lit in secret behind the windbreak, a candle stub hidden in a tin cup. Sometimes they got away with it. Sometimes the ship smelled smoke and everything changed. Bells rang, buckets slammed against wood. Men formed chains from the sea to the hatch, passing water hand to hand. The captain's voice cut through the panic like thunder. No shouting, no running, find the flame. They learned to move fast and quiet because panic wasted air. Even a small fire was a monster. It crawled behind panels, between beams, where hands couldn't reach. It ate from within. Those who survived a shipboard fire never forgot the sound, the crackle of tar, the muffled roar inside the hull. One French sailor described it in his log as the ship breathing smoke like a dying beast. Another wrote that the heat came like a storm in reverse, rising from below. Fire on land could be fought, fire at sea could only be escaped, and the sea was seldom kind enough to let that happen. Because of this, the idea of flame carried a strange holiness. When a lantern was lit at dusk, every man nearby paused for a heartbeat. The light was life and danger in the same breath. They treated it with the same respect they gave the captain's orders, or the ocean itself. Superstitions grew around it. Never whistle near a flame, never point at one, never curse while lighting it. Old sailors claimed that the sea gods punished arrogance with sparks. Yet from that fear came invention. Lanterns were double-walled, vented from above, hung on swinging hooks that kept them upright even in rough water. The galley was placed amidships, the most stable part of the vessel, and lined with copper sheeting to reflect heat. Buckets of sand stood ready at every hatch. Some ships even carried small lead boxes filled with water for quenching glowing coals. Out of terror grew engineering, and still, on the coldest nights, the men dreamed of fire. They thought of the hearths they'd left behind, of taverns glowing amber, of smoke curling lazily from cottage roofs. Out here, warmth was a memory you could smell but not touch. The only flame allowed to live freely was the sun itself, and even it disappeared for long stretches behind grey clouds. So they learned to make do, to warm their hands with friction, their spirits with rum, and their souls with stories told in the dark. Every generation added another warning to the unwritten code of the sea. Never trust what burns too easily. And in that restraint was a kind of wisdom. Fire represented everything the ocean hated: pride, carelessness, haste. The men who learned to fear it also learned patience. They moved slower, thought longer, respected limits. It was the same discipline that kept their ships alive through storms and ice. When the age of steam arrived, many old sailors couldn't believe what they saw. Ships built around engines, ships that fed on fire. To them, it felt like tempting the gods. "We spent our lives keeping flame out," one retired boatswain said, "and now the world builds its future on it." But the sea changes as men change. Iron replaced oak, rivets replaced nails, and soon the old fears faded into history. Yet if you walk the decks of a preserved wooden ship today, you can still feel that ancient caution. The wood smells faintly of pitch. The lanterns hang heavy and dull. You can almost hear a whisper between the timbers, "Keep the flame away." It's the voice of centuries of sailors, murmuring the lesson that kept them alive, that sometimes survival depends not on what you have, but on what you refuse to bring aboard. The first line of defense against the sea's cold was not fire, nor blankets, nor luck. It was fabric. A sailor's uniform wasn't a fashion statement. It was armor against the elements. And that armor, more often than not, was made of wool. Wool was a miracle born from discomfort. It was coarse, itchy, heavy when wet, and smelled faintly of sheep and lanolin, yet it kept men alive. Long before the age of synthetic fibers, sailors discovered that nothing held warmth quite like wool. It could absorb nearly a third of its weight in water without feeling wet to the touch. Even when soaked through with salt spray, it trapped a layer of air close to the body, a small invisible furnace fueled by breath and motion. A typical sailor's outfit in the 18th or 19th century was a patchwork of necessity. A woolen undershirt clung to the skin, followed by a coarse shirt of linen or hemp. Over that came the jumper, a thick hand-knit sweater, often passed down or made by wives and mothers back home. Some had simple cable patterns, others intricate designs unique to a port or family. Folklore claimed that if a sailor's body washed ashore, his jumper's pattern could identify him. It was both comfort and identity, life and death woven together. Over the jumper, sailors wore canvas trousers, stiff and windproof, and a jacket or coat treated with oil. The oil came from linseed, whale fat, or fish. It made the fabric smell awful and darkened it to a permanent sheen, but it turned away water like wax. When the sea lashed against the deck, that oily coat kept the chill from seeping in too fast. Gloves were rare, but when available, they were woolen too. The fingertips wore out quickly from ropes and knots. So many sailors simply cut them off, leaving their hands half protected, half raw. Boots were another story. Leather, when constantly wet, stiffened and rotted. So many went barefoot. It sounds cruel, and it was. But calloused feet gripped slick decks better than worn leather soles. In freezing weather, they wrapped rags or strips of sailcloth around their feet, changing them often to avoid frostbite. On some voyages, men even tied bits of old rope around their ankles as makeshift insulation. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Sleep, too, demanded ingenuity. The sailor SS hammock, a cradle of canvas or hemp rope, was the closest thing to warmth many men had. Suspended between beams, it hugged the body tightly, reducing air circulation and trapping heat. A man wrapped in his hammock could sleep through storms that would roll any other bed. He'd climb in fully clothed, sometimes even with his boots still on, using his coat as a blanket. The more bodies in the hold, the warmer it became. Human heat was their shared currency, invisible, constant, and free. It wasn't pleasant. The air below decks was thick, wet, and filled with the sound of breathing. Condensation dripped from the ceiling in slow rhythm, like a leaking faucet that never stopped. But that humidity, unpleasant as it was, also kept the air warmer than the deck above. In that cramped space, a strange warmth grew. Not comfortable warmth, but the kind that softened stiff fingers and let a man drift into dreamless sleep. Sailors learned to help one another in small, wordless ways. They'd hang their soaked clothes near the galley, where faint heat could dry them. They'd share blankets, swap dry socks, or trade for a square of oilcloth to patch a leaking coat. The hierarchy of the sea didn't vanish, but in the cold, rank meant little. Warmth was communal, and generosity could mean survival. During watch shifts on deck, where the wind bit hardest, movement was the only defense. Men stamped their feet, slapped their arms, or climbed the rigging to keep blood flowing. The rhythm of labor itself, hauling ropes, scrubbing decks, bracing sails, was their furnace. Work was warmth. A sailor who stopped moving froze fast. The ocean rewarded activity and punished idleness. And still, there were moments when even the strongest grew numb. During Arctic voyages, men would wake to find their beards frozen stiff, salt crystals clinging to their eyelashes. Wool turned to armor plates, stiff and white. To thaw, they'd huddle together below deck, their breath steaming in the gloom. Someone might hum an old tune, the kind sung in every port from Lisbon to Liverpool, and the sound itself seemed to carry a little heat. Voices filled the air like smoke rising from an invisible fire. What they lacked in luxury, they replaced with habit. Routine became warmth. Every man knew when to turn in, when to rise, when to swap soaked garments for dry. They dried socks against their own skin, letting body heat work slowly through the fibers. They stuffed spare clothing inside their hammocks for insulation. Some even slept with smooth stones wrapped in cloth, heated near the galley stove earlier in the evening, and pressed them against their chests. The stones cooled quickly, but for an hour or two they gave comfort. The officers in their cabins had it a little easier. Brass oil lamps flickered behind glass panes, casting gold light over maps and instruments. They too wore wool, though finer, and their quarters were lined with extra planks that kept drafts out. But even captains knew the chill that crept through wood at night. In letters home, many wrote not about storms or battles, but about cold. That endless creeping cold that seemed to live inside the ship itself. For the men below, warmth was a shared illusion, fragile, fleeting, but enough to carry them through one more night. When dawn came and the hatch opened, a rush of cold air filled the hold. Steam rose from the men's breath like ghosts fleeing their bodies. They'd groan, curse softly, swing out of their hammocks, and start the day's work again. The cycle never changed. Movement, effort, endurance, that was their fire. And somewhere between the waves and the wood, between exhaustion and routine, they found a strange kind of peace. The sea was merciless, but fair. It gave them no comfort they didn't earn, no warmth they didn't make themselves. And in that endless struggle, a quiet dignity was born, the kind that comes not from triumph, but from perseverance. When the sea turned grey and the cold set in, there were few pleasures left aboard a wooden ship, but meals, even simple ones, were sacred. They weren't feasts, nor were they warm in the way of home-cooked stews, yet they gave sailors the illusion of warmth. And sometimes that was enough to keep the spirit alive. Cooking on a wooden ship was an act of controlled madness. The galley, the ship's kitchen, was little more than a fireproof box built amidships, where the motion of the vessel was least violent. It contained an iron stove, bolted tight to the deck, with its chimney carefully led through a hole in the planking and out to the open air. Around it were barrels of sand and sheets of copper meant to catch stray embers. The cook's job was not just to prepare food, it was to keep the ship from burning down while he did it. What came out of that galley wasn't gourmet, but it was fuel. Thick, heavy, starchy fuel that filled the belly and pushed back against the chill. A sailor's ration might include salted beef or pork, hardtack biscuits, dried peas, oatmeal, and the occasional onion or carrot if the voyage had begun recently. The meat was preserved with salt so harsh it had to be boiled several times before eating. The biscuits were so tough that men often softened them with hot water or rum, and if they were unlucky, they'd find small weevils crawling inside. They didn't throw them away, they just tapped the biscuits against the table to shake the creatures out. Protein was protein. Hot meals were rare, but when the sea allowed it, they meant everything. A single pot of boiling stew could lift morale more than a week's pay. The steam rising from the kettle filled the galley with warmth that spread, however faintly, through the nearby decks. Men gathered when they could, not to watch the food cook, but to feel the ghost of heat escaping from the iron stove. Some held their hands near it for a moment before the cook chased them off with a ladle. They laughed, but they understood. Too much excitement near fire meant trouble. Sometimes, in the middle of long voyages, ingredients ran low and creativity took over. Salt pork might be boiled with peas to make a kind of soup or mixed with flour to form dumplings. When supplies dwindled further, the men made lobscouse, a thick mash of whatever remained, stirred together until unrecognizable. It wasn't pleasant, but it filled the stomach, and a full stomach made a man warmer, even if the warmth came from illusion rather than fire. Then there was the rum. The Royal Navy issued it daily, a tradition born of necessity and morale. A small measure of dark rum, about half a pint, diluted with water, became known as the tot. It wasn't enough to intoxicate most men, though some saved their portion to drink it all at once. But what mattered wasn't the alcohol. It was the ritual. The first sip sent a false heat through the chest, a spreading glow that made the wind seem softer, the sea quieter. It was, in truth, a trick of the body, but it was a welcome one. Sailors swore by rum as medicine. It steadied hands, they claimed, and kept the cold from biting too deep. In letters home, some called it liquid fire, the only kind of flame the sea allowed. Even the captains knew its value. A disciplined crew was a sober crew, but a crew entirely deprived of warmth, comfort, or pleasure was dangerous. So the rum ration continued, steady as the tides. Tea and coffee, when available, were luxuries. By the late 18th century, British ships sometimes carried casks of tea for officers who shared it sparingly with the crew. The first cup of hot tea on a freezing morning could bring tears to a sailor's eyes. It wasn't just the flavour, it was the reminder of home, of hearths and firesides far beyond the horizon. The smell of boiling water mixed with leaves was, for a moment, a memory of land. When conditions turned severe, when the sea froze on deck and ropes turned to iron, captains sometimes ordered extra issues. More meat, more rum, more grog. Grog was the sailor's drink, rum diluted with water and mixed with lemon or lime juice when possible to fight scurvy. Warmed slightly near the galley, it became a lifeline in liquid form. Men cupped their hands around tin mugs, inhaled the sharp scent, and let the heat slide down their throats. For a few minutes they forgot the wind. Food and drink weren't merely sustenance, they were ceremony. Meals were served by the clock, no matter the weather. Bells marked the time, and men came in shifts to collect their portions. There was no dining room, only mess groups who sat wherever they could find space, plates balanced on knees, the deck swaying beneath them. Conversation was low, laughter rare, but the rhythm of eating gave structure to chaos. It was one of the few moments when the sea seemed to pause. In those quiet hours, warmth wasn't something physical, it was emotional. It came from habit, from the familiarity of the same tin bowl passed hand to hand, from the sight of steam rising against lantern light. It came from the simple fact of eating together, surviving together. The food might be terrible, but it was shared, and shared hardship, more than anything else, kept men alive. After the meal, the galley's faint warmth lingered in the air. It mixed with the smell of salt, smoke and sweat, a scent that clung to every ship like memory. The cook would douse the coals, seal the iron doors and wipe his hands on his apron. For another night, the fire had behaved. Another day survived without disaster. Above deck, the stars blinked coldly, indifferent to the small struggles of men below. Yet inside that wooden hull, a kind of fragile warmth persisted, made of rum, routine, and resilience. It wasn't enough to chase away the cold entirely, but it was enough to keep the crew dreaming, which, on the sea, was the same thing as hope. At sea, stillness was a luxury no sailor could afford. When the wind howled through the rigging and frost formed along the railings, movement became survival. Every task aboard a wooden ship, from scrubbing decks to hauling ropes, was a silent war against the cold. The men might not have realized it, but the rhythm of their work kept them alive. A ship was never at rest. Even in calm weather, something always needed doing. Sails had to be trimmed, ropes coiled, decks scrubbed, barrels shifted, leaks patched, pulleys greased. The sea was patient, but it never forgave neglect. Salt ate everything: rope, wood, metal, skin. If a man stood still too long, the ocean would find a way to make him pay for it. So sailors learned to move constantly, not out of obedience but instinct. The day began before dawn. A bell rang, muffled by the wind, and the watch changed. Men rolled out of their hammocks, half asleep, boots thudding softly on the planks. They climbed the ladder to the deck and stepped into the icy dark. The world above was endless grey, clouds merging with the horizon, waves rising like black hills. The wind bit at exposed skin, but they ignored it. Orders came quickly, ropes had to be hauled, sails adjusted. The cold didn't matter when your hands were full of work. There was no better way to warm the blood than pulling on a line while shouting in rhythm with 50 others. The effort drew heat up from the body's core, spread it through muscles and bone. A sailor's hands were always moving, tying knots, scrubbing, sanding, mending. His feet stomped across slick boards, his shoulders strained beneath the weight of the mast's sway. The cold air stung, but it also reminded him he was still alive. Sometimes, when the wind eased and the ship steadied, the captain would order holy stone duty, the ritual of scrubbing the deck with sandstone blocks and seawater. Men knelt in rows, pushing stones back and forth until the wood shone pale and clean. It was exhausting, pointless work to outsiders, but it kept men warm. The friction of labor, the sound of brushes, the constant rhythm of movement, it created a kind of music. The ship hummed with it, a heartbeat against the silence of the sea. The sailors didn't talk much while they worked. Words froze in the air, and effort needed breath. But they had songs, shanties they called them, simple melodies that matched the pull of a rope or the lift of a sail. "Heave away!" they'd chant, voices overlapping, boots thudding, hands raw. The songs were never about warmth, but they carried warmth in them, the kind that came from unity. 100 men pulling as one, the cold forgotten for a while. When storms came, work became fury. The deck tilted underfoot, rain turned to needles, and the air smelled of iron and salt. Men climbed rigging slick with ice, their fingers stiff, their breath ragged. The higher they went, the colder it grew, but there was no choice. To leave a sail unfurled in a gale was to risk the ship itself. So they climbed. They tied knots in the dark, the wind screaming like a living thing around them. When they returned to the deck, soaked and shaking, their hearts burned with life. Fear, exhaustion, and movement, the body's oldest fire. Even in calm seas, the rhythm never stopped. Cleaning, pumping out bilge water, polishing brass, repairing lines. Every motion staved off the chill that crept through wood and skin alike. On long voyages, the officers often invented work just to keep spirits high. A man busy was a man warm, and a warm man rarely quarreled. The greatest enemy aboard wasn't boredom or hunger, it was idleness. When a sailor sat still too long, he started thinking of the cold, of home, of what he'd left behind. Thoughts like that could freeze the mind faster than frost froze the hands. So work became comfort, not joy, never joy, but a steady rhythm that replaced thought. Men began to measure time not by hours, but by tasks. Coil this rope, then scrub that deck, then eat, then sleep. The repetition dulled the senses, but it also softened misery. When the body ached, the mind grew quiet, and in that quiet, warmth returned. At night, after the day's labor, the deck would glow faintly in the lantern light. Men sat in small groups, mending clothes, patching boots, carving bits of wood. The air was cold, but their hands stayed busy. Some hummed under their breath, others told short stories or recited verses they half remembered. Work didn't stop when the bells rang, it simply changed shape. The rhythm of motion, even small, pointless motion, became a lullaby. Officers noticed this too. They knew that work kept discipline alive. A man who toiled had no time for rebellion. So they assigned duties in endless rotation, cleaning the anchors, hauling the longboat, scraping barnacles from the hull. It was punishment and preservation wrapped in one. Even the laziest sailor eventually learned that sweat was cheaper than shivers. When dawn broke again, the process repeated. The same ropes, the same sails, the same cold wind. But within that sameness, there was safety. The ship moved forward, the men endured, and the sea, vast, cold, eternal, allowed them another day. The warmth they made with their muscles and breath wasn't fleeting like firelight. It was earned, steady, honest. It was the warmth of survival, the kind that came from doing rather than having. And in that rhythm, the scraping, the hauling, the chanting, they found something resembling peace. The cold never truly left them, but neither did the motion. The two balanced each other perfectly, endlessly, like the sea and the sky. There were winters when the ocean seemed to forget it was water. The waves slowed, the spray froze in mid-air, and every rope, every plank, every nail aboard the ship turned to ice. To sail through such a world was to live inside a coffin of frost, a wooden cage creaking under the weight of a frozen sky. These were the voyages that tested not courage, but endurance, the kind of quiet stubbornness that outlasts even the will to complain. The North Atlantic was the great trial. Ships leaving England, France, or Spain for the New World often found themselves trapped between storms and ice. The decks became glassy with frost, the rigging hung heavy with icicles as thick as a man's arm, and the sails, once white and billowing, stiffened into boards that cracked when bent. Men had to climb into the rigging with hammers just to break the ice off the ropes before they could raise a single sail. Their hands bled where the frost bit through their gloves, if they had gloves at all. The cold was not just a temperature, it was a presence. It crept into every space, turning breath to mist and wood to stone. The boards beneath their feet shrank and groaned. Water barrels froze from the inside out, forcing men to chip ice with knives just to drink. When they ate, their spoons stuck to their lips. When they spoke, the air itself seemed to swallow their words. The sea became a mirror, black, motionless, endless. Even sound moved slower. Inside the ship it was little better. The hammocks, once soft with warmth, stiffened like planks. Men woke with frost on their beards, their hair frozen to the canvas above them. The damp that had once kept them sweating now turned to rime on every beam. They learned to sleep curled tight, arms against their chests, legs bent, every inch of the body trying to conserve a scrap of heat. Some wrapped sailcloth around themselves, others slept two to a hammock, back to back, pretending not to notice. The cook's galley became a kind of shrine. On the coldest mornings, the stove smoked weakly, the chimney half blocked with ice. Men crowded near it not to eat, but to feel. The faintest warmth drifting through the vents could draw a dozen sailors from their duties. They'd stand shoulder to shoulder, hands outstretched, eyes closed. It wasn't heat they sought. It was memory, a reminder of fire, of home, of something alive. Then came the nights, long, silent, endless. In northern latitudes, darkness lasted 18 hours. Lanterns burned dimly behind iron grates, the light trembling in the cold. Outside, the world was gone. No horizon, no stars, just the sound of ice grinding against the hull. The ship moved slowly, groaning with each shift of the frozen water beneath. Every creak sounded like a warning. Men whispered that they could hear the ocean breathing, slow and shallow, as if even the sea was half asleep. Frostbite was an old companion. Fingers blackened, ears split, skin peeled like bark. The ship's surgeon had little to offer but rum and rags. He'd rub the affected limbs with snow, the old method, and pray it worked. Those who lost fingers or toes didn't complain loudly. They simply tied the wounds and went back to work. At sea, there was no room for pity. The living envied the numb. But the human body is a stubborn thing. It adapts, slowly, painfully. Within weeks, the cold became a kind of rhythm, a steady hum that surrounded everything. Men learned to move carefully, to breathe through their noses, to keep their mouths shut lest their teeth ache from the chill. They ate more, slept less, sang softly under their breath to keep their minds from freezing too. It was survival through motion and memory. Some captains, desperate to preserve morale, allowed small fires to burn in iron buckets on deck during calm weather. These were called sea braziers. They burned charcoal or coal, watched constantly, never left alone. The warmth barely reached beyond an arm's length, but sailors would stand in line for a turn near it, hands trembling over the dull red glow. The smell of burning fuel, sharp, metallic, alive, was intoxicating. For a few minutes they could pretend the sea wasn't trying to steal their heat. When ice formed on the hull, it had to be beaten off with hammers. The weight of frozen water could drag a ship down. Men worked in shifts, striking at the hull until their tools stuck to their hands. They cursed, laughed, sang, anything to keep moving. The rhythm of hammering echoed across the waves, a heartbeat against the stillness. Some said it was the only sound that kept them sane. There were moments of terrible beauty too. At dawn, the horizon glowed faintly blue, and the world shimmered under a coat of frost. The rigging sparkled like crystal. Even the cannons looked like sculptures. Men stood in silence then, their breath rising in white clouds, staring out at a sea so cold it seemed made of glass. For all its cruelty, the ocean could still humble them with beauty, and somehow they survived it. Ship after ship made it through the frozen months, limping into port covered in ice. Crews pale and ragged, but alive, they brought stories of seas that sang when the wind blew across the ice, of decks so cold they cracked, of nights when the northern lights danced above like curtains of fire. Those lights, they said, were the spirits of the sea, burning without heat, mocking their suffering. But even that mockery was welcome. It meant the world was still moving, still alive. By the time spring came and the thaw began, men wept at the sound of dripping water. The crack of melting ice against the hull was music. They'd strip off layers, let the sun touch their faces, and breathe deep the air that no longer hurt. The ship, too, seemed to sigh in relief, creaking as if stretching after a long sleep. For months it had carried them through a frozen world without flame, without comfort. And somehow it had worked. The sea had taught them its cruel lesson once again. That warmth was not something you waited for. It was something you made. Through effort, through motion, through endurance. A man who could survive the frozen ocean carried that truth with him forever. On land by the fire he might still shiver, not from cold, but from memory. The sea had its own alchemy, a way of turning ordinary things into instruments of survival. Aboard a wooden ship there were no luxuries, only materials with purpose. The same wool that scratched the skin, the same salt that preserved their food, and the same oil that slicked the decks and sealed the sails. These were the elements that kept men alive in a place where warmth was forbidden. Wool was life. It was everywhere. In clothing, in blankets, even stuffed into cracks in the ship's walls as insulation. Sailors wore it in layers until their bodies disappeared under weight and smell. Wool trapped air, and air meant heat, even if only a little. When it rained, and it always rained, the fibers swelled, closing the gaps between threads. That swelling, paradoxically, made the cloth more waterproof. A man soaked to the bone could still find warmth beneath his heavy jumper, his shirt glued to his skin by sweat and salt. It wasn't comfort. It was containment. The body's own heat, trapped and recycled, became a kind of shield. Every sailor learned the ritual of drying wool. When the sun broke through even for an hour, hammocks and jumpers were hoisted up the rigging like banners. The ship transformed into a floating laundry line, garments flapping stiffly in the wind. The air filled with the earthy scent of lanolin, the natural grease of wool mixed with salt and tar. For a few hours, the ship looked almost human, like a small town airing out its fatigue. When the clouds closed again, everything went back below decks, still damp, still heavy, but somehow renewed. Then there was salt, the sea's cruelest and most generous gift. Salt preserved the food, cured the meat, treated the wounds, and destroyed the skin. The same substance that kept sailors alive also ate away at them, grain by grain. Their hands cracked, their lips split, their eyes burned from spray. And yet without it, they would have starved months before reaching shore. Barrels of salted beef and pork lined the hold like treasure chests. Each barrel smelled of brine, meat, and decay. When opened, it released a thick, sharp odor that clung to everything nearby. To newcomers, it was nauseating. To veterans, it was the smell of sustenance. The sea itself was made of salt, and it marked everything it touched. The ropes turned stiff. The wood bleached white along the edges, the sailors' clothes crusted over with fine crystals that shimmered in sunlight. When they laughed, rare as that was, the salt cracked at the corners of their mouths. They carried it home on their skin, in their hair under their fingernails. Even on land, months later, they could still taste it when they licked their lips. It was the sea's reminder, you belong to me now, and then oil. If salt was the sea's curse, oil was its answer. Oil was everywhere. Whale oil, fish oil, linseed, even tar oils distilled from pine. It coated everything that mattered, the hull, the ropes, the sails, the clothes. Oiled canvas repelled water better than anything else. Jackets treated with linseed or fish oil turned dark, shiny, and nearly waterproof. The smell was revolting, heavy and fishy, a stench that sank into the skin. But it saved lives. When the rain came sideways, or the waves crashed over the deck, that oiled coat was a thin line between warmth and death. The process of oiling was almost ceremonial. Before long voyages, sailors would lay out their coats and rub the fabric with oil by hand, pushing it deep into the weave. The oil darkened the cloth to a dull brown and made it glisten like wet leather. When dry, it stiffened, hard, almost armor-like, but it would bend with use. Some men preferred to wear old coats, soft with years of oiling and salt, molded perfectly to their shape. A new one was a burden, until it was broken in by storms. Whale oil was especially prized. Thick, clear, and long-burning, it fueled lanterns and preserved wood. When whaling ships processed blubber, they did so on deck in massive iron pots, boiling the fat into golden liquid. The smell was indescribable, sweet, rancid, choking, but the result was precious. Every drop of oil meant light, lubrication, or waterproofing. Sailors on cargo ships bought it in small jars, enough to coat a jacket or a pair of boots. In their world, oil wasn't filth. It was protection. Together, wool, salt, and oil formed an invisible triangle of survival. Wool trapped the body's warmth. Salt preserved what could not rot. Oil sealed everything else from the sea. The three worked in harmony, like elements in a grim symphony. Without one, the other two failed. A sailor, stripped of any of them, was a man already half dead. Even the ship itself was made of these same things. Its timbers were soaked in salt air, its seams sealed with oakum, tarred rope fibers mixed with oil, and its sails smeared with tallow to keep out water. The vessel was, in a sense, a giant version of the men who served it. A body held together by salt and grease, warmed only by movement, constantly decaying yet endlessly enduring. At night, the smell of these materials filled the air. Wool damp with sweat, salt drying on skin, oil leaking from the ropes. The combination was pungent, unforgettable, oddly comforting. It was the scent of existence at sea, raw, human, elemental. To anyone born on land, it would seem unbearable. But to those who lived months within it, that smell was home. The reek of oil meant the deck was safe from rot. The sting of salt meant the food would last. The itch of wool meant the heart was still beating. Long after they returned to shore, sailors carried those scents with them. Their coats left greasy marks on tavern benches. Their hair smelled faintly of fish and tar. Some washed for days, trying to shed the sea from their pores. Others didn't bother. They knew it never really left. The materials of survival weren't just tools. They were proof. Proof that a man had faced the elements, bartered with the ocean, and come back with his warmth still his own. The sea was never truly silent. Even in calm weather, the ship spoke, in creaks, in sighs, in whispers through the ropes. The timbers flexed with every wave, each joint groaning softly as though the vessel were alive, breathing alongside the men who slept inside it. To live aboard a wooden ship was to be surrounded by sound, not noise in the modern sense, but a constant symphony of small, familiar voices. For sailors, those sounds were comfort. They meant the ship was still moving, still whole, still theirs. When a man lay in his hammock, the world around him was an orchestra of survival. Above, the sails rustled like cloth ghosts shifting in the wind. The masts groaned deep in their sockets, like old bones turning in sleep. Chains clinked softly, pulleys squealed, and somewhere far below, water slapped the hull in slow, rhythmic beats. The air carried every vibration through wood, a whisper, a sigh, a hum that never ended. To outsiders, it would have been maddening. To sailors, it was a lullaby. Every noise had meaning. The way the boards creaked told you how the sea was moving. A sharp crack from the mast meant the wind had shifted. The gurgle of bilgewater below warned when the ship was leaning too far. Men could tell by ear when the sails were straining, when the anchor chain dragged, when the storm was still too far to see. Their world was made of sound, invisible signals that replaced sight in the darkness. In the deepest hours of the night, when the lamps burned low and even the sea seemed to sleep, silence took on its own kind of power. True silence aboard a ship was terrifying. It meant the wind had died, the sails hung limp, the world stopped breathing. In those moments, every man listened harder, waiting for a sign, a crack of rope, a gust through the rigging, anything to prove the ocean still remembered them. Silence in the middle of the sea felt like death, but there were other silences, softer, human ones. When the night watch changed and tired men crept into their hammocks, the only sounds were the soft rustle of fabric and the slow rhythm of breathing. Dozens of men swaying together in the dark, their movements synchronized like waves. The ship seemed to cradle them, each creak in the wood answering their sighs. The cold was there, always, pressing against the hull, but the closeness of bodies and the low murmur of sleep gave the illusion of warmth. In that fragile peace, sound and silence worked together, one reminding them of danger, the other offering rest. The sea's soundscape could change in an instant. When storms came, the noise became violence. Rain hammered the deck, wind screamed through the rigging, and the waves struck like cannons. Orders were shouted but lost in the roar. The ship itself howled, ropes snapping, sails flapping like thunder. Every noise blurred into one overwhelming voice, the voice of the ocean. Men learned to hear through it, to find rhythm in chaos. The crash of the sea became a drumbeat to their labor. The cries of gulls vanished. The human ear adapted, sorting life from death through vibration alone. In calmer moments, sound returned to gentler things. The clatter of tin bowls at mealtime, the scrape of boots on the deck, a low song drifting from the forecastle carried by men off duty. These songs, the work shanties, the sea ballads, the half-forgotten hymns, were more than entertainment. They were medicine. Music was warmth in another form. When voices rose together, it reminded the crew that they were not alone in the void. A typical shanty had no instruments, only rhythm. "Haul away, boys!" shouted between pulls of a rope. The words changed from voyage to voyage, but the rhythm never did. It bound men together like invisible rope. Even when their hands bled and their backs ached, the chant gave them tempo. It gave them something human to hold on to when the wind tore everything else away. And when no one sang, there were other small sounds that anchored the mind. The knock of the helmsman's pipe against the railing, the soft splash of the log line dropped to measure speed, the bell that marked each watch ringing faintly through fog. Those bells were the heartbeat of ship life, struck every half hour, echoing across decks and through dreams. They kept time where clocks failed, dividing the endless ocean into pieces men could endure. In the rare moments when the wind was kind and the sea gentle, sound became art. The ship whispered instead of roared. The waves lapped softly, almost playful. Lanterns swung, their glass clinking in rhythm. A man could lie awake and hear the sea tapping the hull like fingers on wood. He might imagine it speaking to him, not with words, but with pattern. The ocean's conversation, constant, patient, and never quite understood. There were stories among sailors of men who went mad from silence, those who served on ships becalmed for weeks, where the air refused to move and the sails hung dead. The heat built, the food rotted, and the quiet became unbearable. Some claimed they could hear their own heartbeat echoing through the hull. That was when the mind began to turn inward, to invent noises just to fill the void. A knock here, a whisper there. The sea, they said, could speak to those who listened too long. Yet for most, sound was sanity. The familiar groans of the ship, the sigh of wind, the scrape of rope. They were proof that life still moved, that the world had not forgotten them. Even when they lay in darkness, shivering beneath damp blankets, the hum of the sea lulled them to sleep. It was the only song that never ended, a tune older than mankind, older even than the wood that carried them. When they returned to land, many sailors struggled with quiet rooms. The silence of stone walls unnerved them. They'd lie awake, missing the endless groaning, the steady rhythm of waves. Some said that when they closed their eyes, they could still hear the ship breathing around them, as if the sea had followed them home. And in a way, it had. The sound of survival never really left their ears. It was part of them now, stitched into the same fabric as salt and wind. When darkness swallowed the sea, the ship became a world of shadows and whispers. Below deck, men slept in their hammocks, cocooned in the damp warmth of shared breath. Above, a few figures remained awake, the night watchmen, guardians of wood and wind. Their job was simple in words, endless in practice: keep the ship alive till dawn. The night watch was divided into shifts, each 4 hours long. The men called them dog watches, for the strange way they broke the night apart, keeping the crew from sinking too deep into exhaustion. The first watch began at 8, when the sun had barely sunk. The last ended at 4, when the horizon began to blush grey. Between those hours, the sea changed character. The noise softened, the wind cooled, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The deck at night was colder than any place on earth. The wood, wet from spray, turned slick as glass. Lanterns burned low, their light muffled by fog. The sails hung like ghosts above, creaking softly, the ropes swaying with every sigh of wind. The air smelled of salt, oil, and something faintly metallic, the scent of the sea's skin under moonlight. The watchman moved quietly through it, boots whispering against the boards. Every sound carried, every sound mattered. One man would take the helm, hands fixed on the wheel, eyes on the compass that glowed faintly with a single candle's light. Another would stand at the bow, peering into the black, listening more than seeing. Lookout duty was both honor and punishment. A good lookout saved lives. A careless one lost them. In fog or moonless nights, they strained their ears for signs of danger. The hiss of breakers over hidden reefs, the groan of another ship's hull, the whisper of wind changing direction. Often there was nothing, only the vast, slow breathing of the sea. It was in those empty hours that loneliness took shape. A man on night watch could feel smaller than thought itself. Around him stretched nothing but darkness and water, no sign of land, no sign of God. The stars above seemed impossibly far, and yet they were his only company. The constellations were old friends, Orion rising over the foremast, the North Star fixed like an anchor in the sky. Men learned to read them not just for navigation, but for comfort. To know where the stars stood was to remember that the world still had order. Sometimes, when the sky cleared, the sea mirrored the heavens perfectly. The ship sailed between two star fields, one above, one below. The waves caught the starlight and scattered it into sparks, tiny reflections that seemed alive. Men swore they could hear the stars crackle on the surface, as if the ocean itself was whispering secrets. Even the most hardened sailor would pause, breath visible in the cold air, and feel something sacred. For a heartbeat, the loneliness was replaced by awe, but beauty couldn't fight the cold. Frost formed on the rigging, ropes stiffened, metal turned to ice. The men kept moving, stamping their feet, rubbing their hands. The officer of the watch paced like a ghost, coat collar turned up, breath trailing in mist. Every half hour the bell rang. The sound was hollow, metallic, echoing across the endless dark. It was the heartbeat of the ship. Each strike meant one thing: still alive. Sometimes the watchmen talked quietly to each other. Small, simple words about home, about food, about nothing at all. A few hummed under their breath, half songs lost to the wind. Some stayed silent, speaking only to the wheel, to the stars, or to God. There was an old superstition that you should never whistle at night at sea. It was said to call the wind, or worse, spirits. So they didn't. They listened instead, and the sea filled the silence. There were dangers even in calm nights. Icebergs drifted silent and invisible. Enemy ships prowled without lanterns. A single mistake could end hundreds of lives. But mostly, danger came from the cold itself. Fingers numbed, minds slowed, exhaustion crept in. A man who nodded off at the helm might steer a few degrees off course. Not enough to notice, but enough to spell ruin days later. So they fought sleep like an enemy. The cold helped with that. It bit at their faces, slapped them awake. In its cruel way, it kept them faithful. Every ship had a moment in the night when time seemed to stop. Usually between 2 and 3, the darkest hour, when even the ocean seemed to hesitate. The lantern light dimmed, the waves grew quieter, and the men felt the weight of the world pressing down. In that stillness, many prayed. Not loudly, not even with words, but in thoughts. A whisper for land, for warmth, for morning. The sea listened in silence. Then slowly, the eastern horizon began to pale. A faint grey glow, so small it seemed imaginary, crept through the mist. The stars faded one by one. The cold deepened briefly, as if the world drew one last breath before the sun. And then, suddenly, there was light. The ocean turned silver, the sails caught color, and the men blinked against the brightness. Dawn didn't bring heat, but it brought hope. The ship came alive again. Below deck, bells rang to wake the sleepers. Above, the night watch exhaled, as if releasing the darkness itself. They had survived another night, another stretch of hours when everything could have gone wrong, but didn't. The stars were gone, the wind had shifted, and the deck beneath their feet was wet and solid. They handed the helm to the next watch, descended into the hold, and collapsed into hammocks still warm from the men who'd left them. For a few hours, they'd sleep while the world above kept moving. And as the ship rolled gently in the new morning light, the ocean's whisper returned, the sound of endless, living motion. For those who stood watch in the dark, warmth was never just heat. It was endurance. It was the small pride of having guarded the ship through the loneliest hours. It was the memory of stars reflected in the sea, and the knowledge that for one more dawn they had kept the fire of life alive, without ever striking a match. Storms didn't arrive. They assembled like armies on the horizon. First came the strange quiet, a pause in the wind, a heaviness in the air, gulls disappearing as if warned by some language men could not hear. Then the sky lowered, grey folding into charcoal, and the sea began to pulse with slow, deliberate force. Sailors learned to read those omens the way farmers read the soil. They tightened lines, checked knots, lashed barrels, and tied down anything that could turn into a weapon once the ship began to pitch. The storm was not yet here, but it was already in the wood. The order to reduce sail felt like a prayer said through clenched teeth. Men swarmed the rigging, boots slipping on wet ratlines, fingers numb even before the rain began. Canvas boomed and snapped above them with the voice of a wild animal. To leave too much sail up was to invite the wind to tear the masts out by their roots. To leave too little was to surrender steerage and let the ship fall broadside to the waves. Between those errors lay survival, a narrow path, adjusted by inches and instincts. Then the first wall of rain hit. Not drops but curtains, hammered flat by the wind. Vision vanished. The deck turned to slate. Ropes swelled and groaned. The helm fought back, the wheel kicking like a living thing beneath the helmsman's hands. Orders were shouted not to be heard, but to be felt. gestures, habits, the choreography of men who had practiced this dance too many times to count. Above, the sky split open and poured its weight into the sea. Cold did not merely return, it sharpened. Wind drove needles into every seam of clothing, and water found every gap. Wool clung heavy to the body, soaked and dragging, but still warming enough to keep the core from failing. Oilskins flashed dull in the lantern glow before the light was smothered by spray. The storm made equals of everyone. Officers and deckhands alike leaned into the same ropes, swallowed the same salt, tasted the same fear. Waves rose like hills, then became walls. A ship does not climb such water so much as negotiate with it. The bow lifted, hung for a breathless second, and then dropped into a valley of green-black glass. The impact slammed through ribs and knees. The whole hull shuddered like a stricken animal. Barrels shifted despite their lashings. The pump crews stood by, hands already raw, knowing that water would find its way in. It always did. The bilge would rise, and with it the steady, punishing rhythm of the pumps. Heave, clank, exhale. Heave, clank, exhale. The music of not drowning. Below deck there was no shelter from the storm, only a different angle of it. Hammocks swung wildly, then knotted to keep men from being thrown to the planks. The hold smelled of wet wool, tar, and fear. Lanterns burned low in their cages, lighting little, smoking much. Men sat with backs against beams, eyes closed, mouthing old prayers. Others worked by touch, checking lashings, feeling for trickles where the seams began to weep. In that darkness, warmth became a memory carried in the chest. You breathed steadily and protected it, the way you'd cup a candle in a gale. The worst danger in heavy seas wasn't always the wave you could see. It was the cross sea, two confused swells colliding from different angles, striking the hull in a rhythm that mocked the helmsman's calculations. The vessel's backbone twisted, the mast screamed, and loose gear turned deadly. A ladle became a blade. A wooden bucket, hurled across the deck by a beam sea, could break a man's leg. Every sailor knew where to stand, and more importantly, where not to stand. Survival was as much geometry as courage. Voices rose into shanties when breathing allowed it, not for cheer, but for tempo. Way hey, drowned by wind, then caught again like a line reeled back from the dark. The chant kept hands together on a heave, kept minds from unraveling. In that noise, decision-making narrowed to essentials. Shorten the foretops in another hand. Strike the jib. Rig a storm trysail. The right cloth, the right angle, the right moment. Stitch by stitch against the sky's attempt to unmake the ship. Then came the green water. Not spray, but the sea itself, boarding over the bow. It roared across the deck, sweeping everything loose into its cold embrace. Men braced for it, knees bent, fingers hooked around belaying pins till knuckles burned. When the rush passed, they did a silent inventory. Who was still here, what was missing, which line had parted, which block had jammed. You learn to count in storms, not numbers but faces. The helm never rested. A good helmsman read the wave train by feel, easing the wheel before the crest arrived, letting the stern slip aside just enough to avoid the breaking top that could shove the rudder out of the water. Lose the rudder, and you lost the ship. The man on the wheel felt the ocean through oak and iron and rope, his body a conduit between will and water. He could not see the horizon, but he could sense it in the drift of force under his palms. Hours stretched, bells forgotten, time measured only in adjustments. Food was a mouthful stolen between lurches. Rum was a medicinal command, not a comfort. Warmth, if it existed, came from work. Shoulders burning, lungs heaving, the furnace of effort keeping the cold from claiming fingertips and thoughts. The ocean tried to slow the blood, to make the mind heavy. The crew answered with movement pitched just short of frenzy, quick, deliberate, constant. There was always a moment, even in the worst of it, when the storm blinked. The rain thinned, the wind shifted as if remembering a previous appointment over another horizon, and the waves lost an inch of malice. No one celebrated. They simply noticed. Sails crept back up in cautious bites of canvas. The pumps kept their rhythm slower now, like a heart recovering. Men took stock of bruises and equipment, tight-lipped, grateful with the privacy of professionals. Someone laughed, short and surprised at nothing at all. Life had edged forward. Afterward, the ship wore the storm on its skin. Scoured decks, torn lines, spliced mid-squall, a new, meaningful dent along a rail. The crew wore it too. Salt rime on eyelashes, barked shins, hands wrinkled white from water and rope. They stripped off drenched layers, wrung them out, and hung them wherever a memory of warmth might pass. Near the galley, along a lee bulkhead, against the curve of a barrel that still held a trace of sun from some other day. Steam rose off bodies and clothing both. The vessel smelled powerfully alive. Wet oak, hot tar, human breath. Night often followed, and with it the hush that only comes after a beating. Men slept like stones, their hammocks swaying in the calmer roll, dreams still full of water climbing the sky. On deck, the watch stood a little straighter, as if the ship had grown older under their feet and deserved respect for it. The stars returned felt impossibly tender. You could see your breath again, not snatched away by shrieking air, but hanging softly, as if the world had forgiven you. Storms taught the oldest lesson of the sea. You don't win against it. You coordinate with it until it lets you go. Warmth without fire survived here because it lived in the cycle of effort and recovery. In wool heavy with rain doing its stubborn duty. In oilskins shining like beetle shells under a guttering lamp. In lungs that refused to stop. The ship, the crew, the storm, all parts of a single grinding machine. And somewhere within that machine, a small and fiercely kept heat endured, cupped against the chest like a secret flame. When the storm passed, it didn't leave silence. It left weight. The air hung heavy with salt, the decks slick with the residue of rain and shattered spray. The ocean's fury faded into long, rolling swells, slow, muscular waves that lifted the ship like a mother rocking an exhausted child. For hours, the crew moved quietly through this aftermath, like men waking from a nightmare they half believed was still happening. The ship itself spoke first. Every beam, every nail, every line seemed to sigh. The rigging dripped steadily, ropes swollen with water, blocks squeaking as if clearing their throats after screaming. Torn sails hung limp and exhausted. The deck looked like a battlefield. Ropes tangled in heaps, splinters scattered like bones, buckets overturned, and seaweed tangled in the railings. The world was colorless, gray sea, gray sky, gray faces. Yet within that monochrome came the faintest trace of warmth, survival. The first sound to return was the hammer. A dull tock-tock-tock, cautious but steady. Repairs began before rest. The carpenter inspected the hull, tapping along planks to find where the sea had left its mark. Sailmakers spread torn canvas across the deck, stitching silently, fingers raw but sure. The boatswain directed the crew to coil new lines, scrape the salt from metal fittings, and tighten what the wind had loosened. Every man worked slowly, methodically, as if afraid that sudden noise might summon the storm back. Below deck, the air was different, thicker, warmer, a mixture of sweat, salt, and damp wool. Men lay in hammocks, boots still on, sleeping so deeply they might have been carved from the wood itself. Others sat up in the dim light, stripping off soaked shirts, rubbing their arms to bring life back into numb flesh. Their bodies steamed in the cold air. Some laughed quietly, not from humor but from relief. The strange laughter of men who had survived by inches. It wasn't joy. It was disbelief wrapped in exhaustion. The cook relit the galley stove, that small sacred fire, and the smell of heat returned. Not flame, not warmth as landmen knew it, but heat. The metallic scent of iron warming water, the faint sweetness of steam. Men gathered near the galley like moths to a lantern. The cook handed out tin mugs of weak tea, and the first sip, even lukewarm, felt like life restarting. The galley itself became a kind of chapel again, its glowing iron walls promising a world still governed by order and warmth. The officers walked the deck, inspecting damage, taking notes in soaked ledgers. Their boots splashed through puddles as they called out to the men below. They didn't praise them. They didn't need to. The fact that the ship still floated was praise enough. A few words, "Well done, lads," or "She held," meant everything. In those moments, rank disappeared. Everyone aboard shared the same humility. The ocean had allowed them to stay. By midday, the sun broke through. A pale, tentative light that glittered on wet ropes and glowed through the ragged sails. It didn't warm much, but it changed everything. Men looked up, faces hollow and salt-streaked, blinking as though they'd forgotten what brightness was. The sunlight turned droplets into tiny jewels. Steam rose from the deck. The ship began to smell like a forest after rain. Wet wood, tar, and the faint sweetness of drying hemp. For the first time in days, men removed their coats, spread their arms, and let the wind dry their skin. That small miracle, the return of light, changed the ship's rhythm. Conversation returned in fragments. Someone sang a verse, half in tune. Someone else told a joke too tired to land. Laughter came anyway. The boatswain grinned, rare and wide, and shouted that the sea had done its worst and lost. The men cheered softly, not in triumph, but in defiance. The ocean had tried to claim them, and they had said no. When the ship settled back into its steady roll, the true work of the calm began. Every tool came out, hammers, needles, tar brushes, splicing knives. The crew moved like surgeons over a wounded giant. Each repair was small, a patch of sail here, a coil of rope there, but together they restored the heartbeat of the vessel. The smell of fresh tar filled the air, thick and reassuring. Tar was life. It sealed the seams, banished leaks, and coated wounds. Even its heatless stickiness felt like protection. Somewhere near the prow, a sailor knelt to relash the figurehead, the carved woman that led the ship through every voyage. Her paint was peeling, her edges chipped, but she still stared into the horizon, as if daring the next storm. Men touched her for luck before returning below. Superstition, perhaps. But after the things they'd seen, superstition was as real as physics. The night after a storm was always the strangest. The sea lay flat as glass, eerily gentle, as if ashamed of its earlier rage. Stars returned, so bright, so countless, and the ship floated in their reflection. No wind, no waves, no sound, but the soft slap of water against the hull. Men slept deeply, unbothered by dreams. Those on watch whispered softly, afraid to disturb the fragile peace. Even the ship seemed to breathe slower, as though it too was resting. When dawn came again, the decks were dry, the ropes coiled neatly, and the sails caught a friendly wind. The ship moved forward, clean and proud. The men had regained their rhythm. The world felt alive again. And beneath it all was that same quiet truth that every sailor carried. Warmth was not a gift of nature, nor a spark of fire. It was the sum of small labors done faithfully after chaos. Each storm left its mark. The sea never forgot, and neither did the crew. The next time the clouds darkened and the wind shifted, they would be ready. Not fearless, but prepared. For sailors, survival was not about strength. It was about respect for the cold, for the ocean, for the fragile warmth that lived in their bones and in the wood that carried them. The storm would come again, and again they would endure. A wooden ship was always breaking and always being fixed, like a living creature whose skin must be stitched as it travels. The ocean took its due in splinters, stretched lines and seams that wept salt. The crew paid it back with tar, hemp, iron and patience. What landmen called maintenance, sailors called survival. There was no day off from decay. The sea gnawed constantly, and the men answered with a slow, stubborn alchemy. The carpenter, chippy to most, was the ship's quiet physician. He carried an adze, augers, caulking irons, and a mallet polished by years of use. When the storm eased or the watch turned, he moved along the hull with a listener's focus, tapping plank after plank. Tock, tock, tock. Sound told the truth. A crisp knock meant solid wood. A dull thud warned of water sneaking in where oakum had tired. He would mark weak seams with a bit of chalk, then return with a caulker's iron and a coil of tow, fibers teased from old rope, black with tar and sticky as a promise. Caulking looked simple, and was not. Strip by strip he drove hemp into the narrow V of each seam, the iron ringing against wood with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Then came the hot pitch, pine tar warmed to a syrup and brushed along the lines until the deck gleamed like lacquer. The smell was rich and smoky, a scent that clung to clothes and hair and memory. It wasn't heat, but it felt like it. The smell of sealed gaps of water kept where it belonged, outside. Nearby, the sailmaker worked a different magic. Canvas never slept. It stretched, chafed and tore at the places where rope met wind. After a blow, sails came down like wounded birds, spread across the deck in pale acreage. Men knelt with palms on rough cloth, locating the hurts by touch. A frayed leech, a rent through the belly, bolt ropes pulled half from their stitch holes. The sailmaker's needles were weapons in miniature, curved and heavy, driven by hand through canvas that had the thickness of skin. Patches went on like grafts. Corner by corner, eyelet by eyelet, the canvas found its strength again. When the sail went aloft once more, you could hear the difference. The way it took wind with a rounder breath, the way it no longer snapped in pain. Rope, too, demanded constant husbandry. Lines took on personalities, obedient or sullen, crisp or swollen with brine. The bosun kept a mental map of every length aboard. Sheets, halyards, braces, lifts, downhauls, a forest of function. When fibers fuzzed, men took to them with palm and needle, splicing with the precision of tailors. A long splice for smooth travel through blocks, a short splice for speed and strength, an eye splice where a faithful loop would be needed day after day. Served lines, bound tight with tarred marline, came away shining and dark, armored against chafe. Thimbles of metal or horn slid into eyes like bones into joints, making each junction take strain without tearing. A single good splice could be the difference between a sail that held and a mast that died. Metal had its own injuries. Iron rusted always, brass dulled, copper loosened along the sheathing where the hull met the sea. The armorer and the carpenter shared these borders, clenching a nail here, replacing a tree nail there, those wooden pegs that swelled in their holes like wooden muscles, holding plank to frame with a strength iron could not match. In calm water, the crew might heel the ship over in a labor called careening, exposing a flank of hull so men could scrape barnacles and weed, the green beard of the sea that slowed a ship and made her sluggish. The scraping was a chorus of gritty music. Afterward, the copper flashed clean as a coin, and the vessel seemed to sigh with sudden speed. Every repair was also ritual. The tarpet hung from a hook, its surface skin rebroken daily, brushed into seams with a care that felt devotional. Oakum baskets sat like nests beside open joints, the fibers soft as unspun wool until tar turned them into sinew. Men warmed their hands above pitch as it smoked. Not enough heat to comfort, but enough to sting the fingers back to life. Knives were honed on a strip of leather. Mallets were set down just so, head outward, handle in, a superstition about luck and a sensible rule about safety. There were larger surgeries too, the kind that wrote themselves into the ship's memory. A cracked yard came down on a tangle of falls and swear words. Then wedges, hoops and fish plates mended it into serviceable straightness. A sprung plank near the waterline demanded a graving piece, a shaped patch keyed into the wound until the hull read smooth to palm and eye. Once when the rudder pintle worked loose in a long following sea, half the crew spent a night up to their waists, guided by lantern glow and shouted angle marks, hauling the bronze back into its bed before daylight found them helpless. By breakfast, the tiller answered again like a tamed beast. All this labor warmed men better than any fire could have. Shoulders burned, breath steamed, wool scratched against skin shining with effort. The body's furnace ran high when a caulking seam needed finishing before the squall returned, or when a topsail had to be bent on while the horizon wore a black line of weather. This was the paradox that governed life afloat. The things that preserved the ship preserved the men. The things that preserved the men preserved the ship. Work and warmth were synonyms made of sweat. Sometimes the sea let them work in grace. A mild afternoon, a modest swell, the sun sketching a silver road off the bow. Shirts peeled back to elbows, tar leaving glossy commas against forearms. Laughter rose easier on such days. A man would tell a filthy joke. The sailmaker would answer in a dialect no one could place. The boatswain would pretend not to smile. The ship smelled less like fear and more like a workshop. Wood shavings, hot iron, clean hemp. You could almost imagine the vessel was a town moving. Night closed the shop without ending it. Tools were wiped with oily rags and stowed. Coils were hung properly, bites even and proud. Canvas was covered. The pitch pail cooled to a black mirror. Men ate, drank, and compared small scars gained since noon. In hammocks, hands throbbed in the cheerful way of honest pain. If dreams came, they were practical dreams. Of the seam you'd finish tomorrow, the block you'd re-reeve at first light, the sound the hull would make when the last leak went mute. Not every repair held. The sea tested all promises. A seam that swore it would stay shut, opened slyly after midnight. A patch that looked perfect on deck, puckered aloft under a hard gust. No one raged at this betrayal. They simply fetched irons and needles and did it again, a little better, a little deeper. The craft taught patience by refusing to reward ego. You didn't outwit the ocean with brilliance. You courted it with persistence. There was a philosophy in these shipboard surgeries, unspoken but lived. Mend small, mend early, mend always. A weeping seam became a leak. A leak became a pump's religion. A failed pump became a prayer. The men learned to love the first symptom, to greet it with tools before it learned to speak fluently. In that way, warmth, the absence of fear, the presence of order spread quietly through the hull. Not heat, but a human climate, things in their places. Lines fair, edges true. When the voyage ended and the ship settled at anchor, visitors sometimes boarded, surprised at how clean everything looked for a creature that had fought weather for months. They saw Tar's black seams like graceful calligraphy along the deck. They saw sails patched with neat geometry. They saw lines that lay in coils as exact as scripts. They smelled the language of the work, resin and salt, oil and hemp, and called it ship smell, as if it were a single thing. The crew traded glances and said nothing. They knew what the scent actually was, the odor of 100 solved problems. In the end, that was the sea's alchemy, turning fatigue into safety, turning habit into shelter. A wooden ship didn't survive because it was strong. It survived because it was kept strong. Every mallet tap, every tar brush stroke, every careful splice was a quiet refusal to let the cold and water have their way. And in that refusal, a steady warmth lived. A warmth made of hands, knowledge, and the daily miracle of not sinking. After the ship's wounds were patched and the tools stowed, another kind of repair began. The daily cleansing that made a vessel less a workplace and more a small, moving civilization. To outsiders, scrubbing decks and polishing brass might have looked like drudgery. To sailors, it was proof that the world had not yet collapsed into chaos. Dirt, salt, and decay were the sea's slow invasion, and cleaning was the counterattack. At dawn, when the watch changed, and the horizon still glowed with cold light, the boatswain's whistle pierced the morning. Men climbed from their hammocks like shades from sleep, pulled on stiff wool, and took up holy stones, blocks of sandstone worn smooth by decades of use. They knelt in ranks, pushing the stones back and forth across the deck in long, rhythmic arcs. Seawater sloshed from buckets, brushes hissed, and the boards brightened under their hands. The motion warmed backs and shoulders. The hiss and scrape filled the air with a steady, meditative cadence. They called it holy stoning, half in jest, half in reverence, for on their knees they looked like penitents. As the sun rose higher, the smell of wet oak and salt thickened. The ship's timbers seemed to breathe again, exhaling the damp of night. Men joked quietly or sang fragments of songs, voices low so as not to break the rhythm. When the deck dried to a pale gold and the seams gleamed with fresh pitch, the boatswain nodded once. Order had returned. The sea had not won overnight. Below, another army went to work. Brass lamps were polished until they caught the faintest light and turned it into warmth. Iron fittings were rubbed with oil, the same whale oil that stank and yet preserved. The pumps were stripped, cleaned, repacked with leather washers. The surgeon boiled his instruments in seawater to scrub away the memory of the last wound. Even the captain's cabin received its share of discipline. Maps folded, instruments wiped, the faint scent of tea leaves masking mildew. Cleanliness was not vanity. It was a defense against despair. Laundry day was a festival of sorts. Shirts, socks and hammocks hung in long lines between masts, snapping in the wind like white flags of truce between man and nature. The entire ship looked suddenly domestic, almost gentle. The smell changed. Less tar, more sun. Salt crust flaked from cloth, falling like snow. For a few hours, the vessel resembled a village airing its soul. Then the clothes came down, stiff and dry, and life returned to its harder textures. In calm weather, barrels were rolled for inspection, bilges pumped until the last puddle gleamed, powder stores checked for damp. Each task ended with the same gesture. A hand laid briefly on the finished surface, a small, silent acknowledgement that the thing was whole again. Touch was the sailor's signature. Where landmen used ink, he used palm and pressure. There was superstition woven into these habits. A dirty deck invited bad luck. An untidy coil meant a tangled line at the worst moment. Men spoke of the ship as if she could feel neglect, as if the sea punished sloth by stealth. Whether they believed it or not, they acted as though it were true. The result was beauty born of necessity. A ship so meticulously tended that even her scars looked intentional. Evenings after cleaning carried a peculiar peace. The decks glowed faintly in lamplight, smelling of salt and fresh wood. The ropes hung straight, the buckets stood in ranks, and the sea reflected the order back like a mirror. The crew sat along the gunwale, mending clothes or pipes, their hands still remembering the day's motions. Talk drifted easily, rumors of ports, of wages, of women. Laughter came softly, rolling with the tide. The ocean might take them tomorrow, but tonight it respected their neatness. The warmth created by all this order was subtle but real. It came not from fire, but from control, the steady comfort of a world briefly mastered. Each polished hinge, each scrubbed board, each folded sail was a small victory over entropy. The men felt it in their bones, the difference between living on a ship and merely surviving inside one. When darkness deepened, the boatswain walked the deck one last time, fingertips brushing the rail. Everything smelled clean and alive. He listened, for the creak that meant loosened rigging, for the whisper of wind promising change. Hearing nothing amiss, he exhaled and went below. The sea outside rolled on, indifferent, eternal. But inside, within the borders of light and order the crew had drawn, a faint human warmth lingered. The warmth of things cared for, of surfaces made smooth again. Meals were more than nourishment. They were punctuation marks in the endless paragraph of ocean days. Between watches, storms, and repairs, food reminded men that time still moved forward. Even the worst salt beef or biscuit carried that promise, a beginning, a middle, an end, and another beginning after. In a world where everything smelled of tar and damp, cooking was an act of quiet defiance, turning decay into sustenance, routine into comfort. The galley was a cave of iron and smoke. Its stove, a low box-like furnace bolted into a cradle of sand and brick, occupied the ship's safest middle, far from sails and timber. The cook was half priest, half jester, living in heat and darkness while the rest of the ship froze. His kingdom measured barely a few paces across, cluttered with pots, knives, barrels of meal, and buckets of water drawn from casks that tasted faintly of wood and salt. Yet from this cramped shrine came miracles, or at least illusions of them. Morning began with the dull percussion of the cook's ladle against tin. Men shuffled forward, eyes half open, mugs ready. The drink was rarely coffee and not quite tea. A grey liquid made from burnt crumbs of whatever leaves or beans could be found. It smelled bitter, metallic, but it was hot. The first sip cut through the fog of sleep, the warmth spreading from throat to stomach, tricking the body into believing it was fed. A biscuit followed, hard as wood, marked with tiny holes, a perfect harbor for the weevils everyone pretended not to see. Sailors knocked them against the table edge, a ritual that shook out the insects before dipping the crumbs in their drink. It was the taste of endurance, not pleasure. By noon, the galley stove roared in its careful confinement. The cook, bare to the waist, sweat mixing with soot, stirred a pot of salted meat and peas. The ship rolled. The pot swung on its gimbal, liquid slapping its lid. The air filled with a thick smell, part salt, part smoke, part something older and unnameable. The stew, peas pudding, was less a recipe than a negotiation between ingredients. Sometimes onions joined in, or bits of biscuit crushed for body. Sometimes a miracle happened and the meat was still soft. More often it was stringy, its brine too sharp, its fat floating in grey circles on the surface. Still, the sight of steam alone could lift spirits. The rum ration came next. A few ounces diluted with water, stirred in wooden tubs, ladled out with ceremony. The boatswain's call summoned every man, and the purser's assistant measured each serving with priestly precision. The first swallow burned, the second soothed. The warmth rose fast, false but welcome, spreading through bellies already moving to the rhythm of the ship. They toasted silently, not to victory or glory, but to the simple fact of still being here. The cook's day never ended. Bread was baked in iron pans directly over the coals, the dough rising sluggishly in the humid air. The smell of it drifted through the lower decks, wrapping itself around dreams of land. Even those who hated bread at home lined up for it here, not for the taste, but for what it represented. Bread meant control, civilization, the ghost of hearth and oven. For a few minutes, the galley became home, and the cook, with his burns and curses, became a kind of mother. Fresh food was a rumor. When the ship neared port, barrels of fruit and vegetables appeared like treasure. Lemons, limes, or apples were sliced thin, their brightness shocking against the grey wood. The men devoured them, the sourness biting but heavenly. They didn't know the word vitamin. They just knew that citrus made their gums stop bleeding. The captain rationed it like gold, sometimes even locking it away. In winter, when scurvy's shadow grew long, men whispered about the next port as if it were paradise. Fish offered rare variety. A lucky crewman might hook one from the bow during calmer seas. A silver flash, caught in the sun, gutted on the spot, cooked within minutes. The entire crew gathered to watch, hungry eyes following the sizzle in the pan. For that brief hour, the sea gave back what it usually stole. The taste was salt on salt, and yet it felt miraculous. When the weather turned kind, the cook dried strips of meat on deck, hanging them between lines. The air did the work slowly, and the smell was both foul and holy. Rats sniffed from the shadows, bold and clever. The cook kept a club handy. Even they needed to eat. Sometimes on ships where food dwindled to starvation, rats themselves became part of the ration. The flesh was stringy, gamey, but no one complained aloud. Hunger silenced disgust more effectively than discipline. Evenings brought the last meal, a repetition of the first, perhaps thicker, perhaps not. The men gathered wherever there was space, beside cannons on crates cross-legged by lanterns. They talked between mouthfuls, voices low. The clatter of spoons and mugs mixed with the sighing of the ship. Afterward came pipes, songs, or silence. The cook wiped his hands on his apron, doused the stove's coals until they hissed and closed the iron doors. The ship cooled again, but for a few hours it had known warmth. There was an art in making these meager meals feel human. The cook learned it without books. A pinch of salt less here, a splash of rum more there, a handful of biscuit crumbs to thicken the soup. He knew the morale of the ship better than the officers did. He could taste it in the way men ate. If the bowls came back empty, hope was still alive. If they lingered half full, something deeper than hunger was wrong. In that floating world, food was not pleasure. It was proof. Proof that hands still worked, that water still boiled, that the rhythm of days still existed beneath the indifferent stars. When the crew lay in their hammocks afterward, stomachs heavy and hearts lighter, the faint warmth from the galley drifted through the wooden ribs of the ship like a ghost, not a fire's heat, but the memory of one, enough to keep the cold at bay until dawn. After weeks at sea, men discovered that the surest fire was the one kindled inside the skull. The body might freeze, the deck might sweat with ice, but memory could burn bright without danger. Each man carried a private hearth made of imagination, and on long watches or sleepless nights, he learned to feed it. They began with stories. Every crew had a teller, some grey-eyed veteran who had circled the Horn or survived wreck and mutiny. He'd start quietly, voice low so it wouldn't wake the officers, a rasp made musical by the creak of timbers around him. The tale might be of ghost ships gliding on green flame, or of mermaids whose songs drove men to jump. The point wasn't belief, it was heat. Words wrapped the listeners in an invisible blanket, each sentence another log on the inner fire. Laughter came easier in the dark. For a few minutes the cold retreated. Letters worked the same magic. When a port was reached, paper and ink appeared like treasure. Men wrote hunched over boxes, fingers cracked, lips moving silently. The words were clumsy, the spelling wild, but the act itself radiated warmth. The thought of wives, mothers, children reading what the sea had not yet erased. Some kissed the paper before folding it, a superstition against distance. Even unread, those letters were small furnaces. A man could unfold one in his mind on a freezing watch and feel a pulse of home. Religion offered another kind of heat. The sea made atheists whisper prayers. On Sundays, if the weather allowed, the captain or a chosen seaman read from a salt-stained Bible on the quarterdeck. The words rose through rigging toward the indifferent sky, half lost in wind, yet the ritual mattered. Hymns sounded strange out there, thin but steady. When the crew sang Eternal Father, Strong to Save, their voices trembled but joined. Faith did what no blanket could. It promised that warmth waited somewhere beyond the horizon. Music, too, was fire. A fiddle, a penny whistle, even a comb and paper. These became instruments of survival. After supper, someone would play, another would stamp time, and the whole turned briefly into a tavern. The rhythm filled the narrow space, and men clapped until their palms stung. The music wasn't good, but it was loud, and in its rough joy they forgot the ache in their bones. The notes bounced off barrels and beams, flickering like sparks before dying back into silence. Some warmth came from ritual work itself. Each watch had gestures that bordered on superstition. The bosun's whistle blown just so, the coiling of a rope in perfect spirals, the wiping of brass until reflection returned. These repetitions steadied the mind. Order created a pocket of comfort, an illusion that the sea's chaos could be tamed by pattern. A man who polished metal until he saw his face shining back, saw proof that he still existed. There were friendships too, quiet, practical alliances formed in hammocks or at the pumps. Two men might share a blanket, a pipe, a story, and in that shared breath, a little warmth lingered. They rarely spoke of affection. They showed it by mending each other's gear, by trading watches, by saving the last gulp of grog. On land, they might never speak again, but at sea, such bonds were firelight. Dreams became the final refuge. The half-sleep of a rolling ship was filled with visions of hearths and kitchens, of grass that didn't move beneath the feet. Some dreamt of summer fields, others of the first girl who had smiled at them. They woke with tears that froze before they fell, but the heat had done its work. The heart beat faster, the blood stirred. Even fear had its warmth. The closeness of danger, the constant awareness of death, sharpened life into something hot and immediate. When lightning split the masthead, or a wave lifted higher than the deckhouse, men felt their own pulse thudding like a drum. Terror reminded them they were still alive, and life itself was heat. By the time the voyage neared its end, these inner fires had replaced the hearths they'd once known. The crew no longer expected comfort from flame. They carried it inside, in habit, in memory, in faith, in laughter, in work. The wooden world around them was still cold, but their minds glowed with a slow, durable ember that no storm could drown. And when they finally stepped ashore, The land's warmth felt almost too bright, too easy. Taverns roared, fires crackled, but many found themselves missing the dim, shared heat of the ship, the warmth earned, not given. For sailors, the truest hearth would always creak, sway, and smell faintly of tar. Landfall was not a moment, it was a slow awakening. Days before a sailor ever saw a shoreline, he felt it. The shift in the wind's scent, the change in the sea's color, the strange way gulls began to appear like wandering thoughts. After months of grey water and colder nights, the hint of earth was overwhelming. It crept into the nose and settled in the chest. Soil, greenery, smoke, the exhale of something that did not move. Men sniffed the air like dogs and grinned at nothing. First came rumor. Someone swore he'd seen a shadow on the horizon, the shape of hills, a smudge not made by cloud. The cry traveled faster than certainty. Hammocks emptied, men poured onto the deck, eyes squinting into sunlight that suddenly seemed warmer. They waited for proof, a line of land that didn't fade when the ship rolled. When it held steady, a cheer went up, hoarse and honest. Even the officers smiled. The sea seemed to share their relief. The swell softened, the wind steadied. Dolphins followed the bow, sleek and careless, as if escorting the weary home. The sails, patched and dulled from storms, filled like lungs one last time. Every rope hummed, every plank flexed. The ship herself seemed to sense that her long ordeal was ending. As land grew clearer, the work of arrival began. Sails came down in careful rhythm, one after another, the canvas folding like tired wings. Lines were coiled, barrels counted, decks scrubbed one more time. The carpenter sounded the well for leaks. Formality now, but habit ruled even at journey's end. Below deck, men packed what little they owned. A knife, a pipe, a piece of rope, perhaps a letter never sent. Some found trinkets from ports half the world away, small shells, a coin, a scrap of colored cloth, souvenirs of survival. The captain stood near the helm, face carved by years of salt, and watched the shoreline sharpen. Palm fronds waved like flags. Smoke curled from huts and chimneys. The sight of human dwellings stirred something complex, joy tangled with disbelief. After so long afloat, the idea of ground that didn't sway seemed both blessing and betrayal. The body had grown to the motion of the ship. Stillness felt foreign. Anchors dropped with thunder, chains clattering through hawse holes. The sound echoed deep through the hull, the vibration singing up through men's boots. The ship shuddered, then rested, a creature finally at peace. Silence followed, vast and strange. For the first time in months, the world stopped moving. The sudden steadiness made some men dizzy. They leaned against masts and laughed softly, embarrassed by their own imbalance. Permission to go ashore never came all at once. Officers went first, stiff in clean coats that smelled faintly of mildew and pride. The crew waited their turn, leaning on rails, watching boats row toward beaches bright with color. The smell of land reached them fully now, mud, fruit, wood smoke, and something sweet they could not name. It was too much. Eyes watered. Some turned away to hide it. When the order finally came, liberty granted 2 watches ashore, men nearly tripped over each other to the gangway. Feet that had learned to grip shifting planks stumbled on the solid dock. The shock of still ground shot up through legs, and laughter burst out wild and boyish. They touched walls, trees, stones, as if testing the truth of them. Some kissed the dirt. Others simply stood, swaying slightly, waiting for the horizon to move again. Taverns waited, of course. Rum, women, noise. But even in their first rush of freedom, sailors carried the sea's rhythm inside them. They sat too close together, shoulders touching, because distance felt wrong. The firelight in taverns made them blink. It was too bright, too hot, too easy. They missed the slow warmth of the galley stove, the disciplined glow of the lantern behind iron bars. They drank fast, laughed louder than necessary, then fell silent all at once, listening to the stillness between waves they could no longer hear. Sleep ashore was uneasy. Beds didn't sway. Air smelled thick with flowers instead of salt. Some woke in panic, convinced the ship had stopped moving for the wrong reason, that she was aground, sinking. Others dreamed of hammocks rocking gently, of the soft whisper of rope. In the morning, they wandered down to the harbor to watch the tide, unable to let go. The ship floated there, patient, familiar, her scars already darkening to match the water. She looked back at them like a mother waiting for her children to come home. When the voyage officially ended, wages were counted, names crossed off. The men dispersed, some to families, some to new ships, some to disappear into ports where no one asked questions. But the sea stayed inside them. They carried it in their skin, in the way they measured distance by the time it took to coil a rope, in the way they still turned their faces into the wind to smell what weather hid behind it. Fireplaces felt dangerous. Too much warmth made them restless. The ship, cleaned and resting at anchor, was suddenly quiet. The carpenter's tools hung motionless. The galley stove went cold. Sails were unbent and folded in the loft. Without the men, she was only wood and rope. Yet if you stood aboard at dusk, you could feel something lingering in the timbers, a pulse, faint but real. The warmth of human endurance soaked into oak, the ghost of laughter, the rhythm of footsteps. The hull creaked softly in the tide, as if remembering voices. For centuries, wooden ships like hers came and went, carrying that same cycle of toil, cold, and return. Each voyage ended with landfall. Each landfall began the longing to leave again. Sailors swore they hated the sea. But when the ground grew too quiet, they found themselves scanning the horizon for wind. Warmth on land was pleasant but fleeting. Warmth at sea, earned through motion, memory, and shared endurance, was eternal. And so, as the sun set on that final evening, the men stood once more by the rail. They watched gulls wheel over the calm harbor, the sky painted gold and violet. The ship rocked gently beneath their boots, as if reminding them of the rhythm that had carried them across the cold. One by one they touched the railing, rough wood smoothed by their own hands, and whispered thanks they could never quite explain. The sea would call again. It always did. And when it did, they would answer, not because they loved the hardship, but because somewhere deep within them, amid all the salt and scars, they had learned the truth that no flame could teach, that warmth is not found in comfort, but in the endurance that keeps a man alive until morning. The question has lingered since the beginning. How did they endure? How did men cross frozen oceans in wooden shells without a single open flame? How did they survive in a world that seemed built to leach warmth from bone and spirit alike? The answer is neither mystery nor miracle. It lies in the quiet mechanics of human life and the architecture of the ships themselves, in physics and in habit, in biology and belief. It worked because men and vessels learned to make a kind of heat that required no fire. Start with the body. A man at sea was a small engine. The muscles that hauled ropes and climbed rigging turned food into energy. Each stroke of an oar, each swing of a mallet released warmth from within. Modern science would call it metabolism, but sailors knew it simply as work. They understood that stillness was death. Movement kept the blood running, kept fingers supple, kept thought from freezing. Even sleep came in short bursts between watches, so that the rhythm of activity never cooled. Work was not only duty, it was insulation. Then there was clothing, layer upon layer of wool and canvas that trapped air close to the skin. Wool, unlike linen or cotton, does not surrender its warmth when wet. The grease left by the animal that grew it, lanolin, repelled water, sealed air pockets, and made each garment a personal furnace. Coarse though it felt, a woolen jumper could save a man from hypothermia after hours of icy spray. The oil-soaked outer layers turned wind aside like armor. Together, the two created a microclimate as effective as any hearth. The ship itself added its own protection. Beneath the planks that met the sea was an air gap, a thin lung running between inner and outer hull. Oak, thick and fibrous, held warmth better than iron ever would. When the hatches were closed at night, 100 breathing men turned the lower deck into a vast living radiator. Their combined heat condensed on the beams, dripping back like rain, a cycle of warmth and moisture that the sea could not quite steal. Cramped, foul and stifling though it was, that space preserved them. In its damp confinement, temperature fell slowly. Their suffering was their shelter. They learned to exploit every trick of design. Hammocks swung not only to save space, but to hold warmth. Canvas cradles that conformed to the body, limiting airflow, conserving energy. Even the slow roll of the ship helped. It kept blood moving, muscles working against the rhythm, a subtle exercise that kept the chill from settling too deep. Below decks, the beams were low, forcing men to stoop and move cautiously. That lack of space prevented large currents of cold air from forming. The ship's very discomfort kept them alive. Food, though plain, played its part. Salted meat, hard biscuit, peas pudding, dense with fat and starch, burned slowly in the body's furnace. A ration of rum or grog opened blood vessels, lending the illusion of warmth long enough for digestion to take over. When combined with constant labor, the calories held. Starvation killed faster than cold ever could, and the Navy's grim efficiency ensured that at least the bare minimum of fuel reached each man. Their meals were crude, but perfectly calibrated for survival. The sea itself offered paradoxical help. The constant humidity kept skin from cracking entirely, and the salt drew water from wounds before rot could set in. Air that never quite dried out also never plunged to absolute zero. The ocean moderated its own cruelty. Wind scoured, but also carried motion and sound, the cues that kept men awake when frost threatened to lull them toward stillness. They lived within the balance of opposites. Cold that killed slowly enough for endurance to matter, damp that preserved as much as it corroded. Discipline filled the remaining gaps. The strict division of watches, the bells, the endless chores, they were as much about warmth as order. Idleness bred cold. A man scrubbing a deck at dawn was not simply keeping it clean. He was generating heat, shaking life back into his limbs. The captain's tyranny was, in a sense, thermal management disguised as morality. The punishment for neglecting a task was severe, not only because work mattered, but because warmth depended on it. The ship's hierarchy functioned as a circulation system, pumping effort through every deck. Beyond these practicalities stood the unseen forces, psychological, communal, even spiritual. Loneliness freezes faster than flesh, and companionship thaws it. The shared rhythm of shanties, the mutual labor at pumps and ropes, the sound of laughter against the wind, all of it turned isolation into something bearable. Humans radiate not only heat but morale, and morale itself is a kind of energy. Hope, memory, superstition, these were fuels no fire could mimic. The man who believed he would see home again was warmer than the one who doubted it. And then there was the ship's own warmth, the strange, organic comfort of a structure that creaked and flexed like a living body. Oak absorbed their touch, their breath, their sweat, and gave some of it back. Generations of sailors left a residue in the grain, an accumulation of human presence that defied the cold. A ship that had carried life long enough became, in its way, alive. It hummed with the memory of heat. This finally is why it worked, because the entire system, wood, wool, salt, labor, faith, formed a single organism. The ship was a moving shelter powered by endurance. Fire would have destroyed it. Instead, they discovered how to ignite something slower and safer within themselves. The warmth of their voyage was not measured in degrees, but in persistence. The ocean tested them with subtraction, taking away every comfort until only essentials remained. What was left was enough. When we imagine those sailors now, huddled in hammocks beneath sweating beams, we think of their hardship. But they would have understood it differently. To them, the cold was a companion, a teacher reminding them to move, to mend, to sing. They did not conquer the sea. They coexisted with it, learned its terms, and found equilibrium. In that balance lay survival. The wisdom endures beyond sail and salt. Every closed room, every winter morning, every hard thing survived without luxury echoes their lesson. Warmth is not the gift of fire, but the reward of effort shared. A hearth can be built of motion, of breath, of voices joined in work. It can exist anywhere, on a storm-tossed deck, in a frozen hold, in the space between two people refusing to give up. So when the ship finally reached port and her crew scattered into the noisy brightness of land, The real miracle followed them, unseen. Inside, each man burned a quiet, steady ember that no weather could extinguish. The memory of having kept life alive without flame, of having turned cold itself into proof of endurance. That ember is the oldest warmth there is, and it still glows wherever humans work together against the vast, indifferent sea.